Namaste and greetings. I, Arunima Marva, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI, #Web Policy Talk. Today, we are gathered for a special talk on women and mental health by Professor Rachana Johri. This deliberation is a part of the State of Gender Equality, #Gender Gaps series, and is organized by Gender Impact Studies Center, GISC, IMPRI. As the chair for today's talk, we have Professor Vibhuti Patel. Ma'am is a visiting professor at IMPRI and a former professor at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, TIS, Mumbai. With the permission of our chair, I would like to introduce the gathering.
Yeah, please go ahead. Introduce all the panelists. Arunima. Yeah.
Okay. So our esteemed speaker for today's session is Professor Rachana Johri. Ma'am is the Director of Center for Psychotherapy and Clinical Research, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, University, Delhi. We welcome you, ma'am. Moving to our esteemed discussants for today, we have with us Dr. Amrita Nandy, who is a researcher and writer on gender, rights and culture, and an adjunct lecturer at Ambedkar University, New Delhi. We are honored to have you, ma'am. Welcome to the session.
Thank you, Arunima. Thank you.
We are delighted to have with us Dr. Cicilia Chettiar, who is the head of the Department of Psychology at Maniben, Nanavati Women's College, Mumbai. We welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you, Arunima.
We are pleased to be joined by Dr. Aparna Joshi, who is an assistant professor at the School of Human Ecology and the project director, iCALL and Sukoon at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, TIS, Mumbai. We welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Arunima, and thanks for the invitation to all the organizers.
Now I would invite our chair, Professor Patel, to initiate the talk with her opening remarks and to proceed with the deliberation. We look forward to learning from the esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Thank you, Arunima. And first of all, I would like to offer my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Arjun Kumar to give the platform under the gender lecture series for such an important topic as women and mental health. I greet Dr. Professor Rachana Johri, Dr. Aparna Joshi, Dr. Cicilia Chettiar, and Dr. Amrita Nandy. We all know that women and mental health has emerged as a critical concern during and post-pandemic triggered health emergency and the social isolation that the communities have faced. We need to understand depression, panic attacks, stress in relation to contemporary social cultural ethos in Indian society, and status of women in the family, the community life, and society in general, and also dynamics of power and the sexual politics. We need to seriously reflect on critical social determinants of mental health, measures for promotion and protection of mental health, and also well-being of the people, as well as methods to foster resilience to stress and adversity. We need to update the notions of femininity and masculinity, heteronormativity, gender binary, differential impact of mental stress as per the intersectional inequality, to examine power and control men and women have over and sexual minorities have over the socio-economic cultural factors impacting their mental health status and lives, their social position, treatment in society, and their susceptibility and exposure to specific mental health risks. The gender-responsive approach to mental health of women implies distinguishing between biological and socio-cultural factors while exploring their interplay and being sensitive to how gender inequality affects mental health outcomes In India, we are educating our girls and women. They get bachelor's and master's degree in arts, commerce, science, management, engineering, but these degrees do not translate into employment or career. A lot of naming and shaming of India has happened for a deplorably low work participation rate as 20% currently. Even when some of them enter the corporate ladder or get jobs, they are kept at the bottom of the pyramid. Among the educated women aspiring careers enhancement, the psychologists have found major stressors as a glass ceiling phenomena, where apparently, notionally, or in principle, you have sky is the limit. But when women try to touch the sky, their heads are banged with the glass ceiling or glass wall, which doesn't allow you any kind of horizontal vertical mobility. There are institutional barriers to isolate women, and they are not given any kind of executive advancement. You also have a glass cliff phenomena where women in the leadership role, such as business executives in the corporate world or women candidates in political offices, are more likely than men to be promoted to leadership roles only during the periods of crisis or a downturn where the chance of failures are highest. Or you also have a sticker floor phenomena where women who are in the workforce, they just languish at the bottom of the hierarchy and there are no chances in a dead-end job that we get. So we need to be sensitive about intersectional locations of women and multiple burdens of caste, class, religion, gender, geographic location, education, which are shouldered by Indian women. A universalist ethic approach that uses diagnostic categories of mental illness such as neurosis, schizophrenia, psychosis, mania, phobia, paranoia, so on and so forth. I think that is found quite inadequate and also detrimental for the women's cause. Psychiatric labeling doesn't take cognizance of material reality faced by women on a day-to-day experiential level. It obscures social realities such as riots, natural disaster, pandemic, fire, accident, while dealing with the phobia among women. While AMIC approach emphasizes cross-cultural psychiatry and evaluates phenomena of mental illness from within a culture. Traditional treatment of mental illness used to be meditation, yoga, group singing, listening to the discourser is now gaining resurgence of interest among the communities. A culturally sensitive counseling on mental health consequences of trauma take into consideration women's socio-cultural environment, and this whole ethic-emic debate, it gave way to a new cross-cultural psychiatry where the emphasis lay on the different contexts of mental illnesses in different cultures, not on the biomedical categories. To understand this multifaceted issue, IMPRI has organized this special lecture by Prof Rachana Johri, and we also have expert discussants, Dr. Aparna Joshi, Dr. Cicilia Chettiar, and Dr. Amrita Nandy. So first of all, we would request Professor Rachana Johri to make her presentation. Over to Professor Rachana Johri.
Thank you, Professor Patel, and I hope I will not deviate too much from some of the things you have said. We will have an interesting discussion, I hope, towards the end. So let me begin right now and let us see where we reach. Well, good evening, and let me begin by saying how grateful I am to be here today. I am honored by the presence of the chair, Professor Vibhuti Patel, and delighted to share my thoughts with Dr. Amrita Nandy and Dr. Aparna Joshi, both of whom I know, and Dr. Cicilia Chettiar, who I hope to get to know better today. It is a great privilege to be given this opportunity to reflect on an issue that is of crucial significance in the lives of women, the question of our mental health. My tentative reflections on the field should not be taken as the voice of a mental health expert. Rather, in speaking on the subject, I will draw upon my reflections as a critical feminist psychologist who has been concerned with women's subjectivities in the deeply patriarchal worlds that make up India. To place myself further, my thoughts on mental health are drawn from my close encounters with both those who suffer from mental illness, from knowing the potential for psychological distress within myself, and several decades of close association with those working towards the alleviation of such distress, beginning with my work at Sanjeevani to my present location as a director of the CPCR, which runs Ehsaas, the low-fee clinic for alleviating psychological distress at Ambedkar University, Delhi. In some ways, the problem of mental health for women remains that of finding ways of exploring the world and finding a self without facing rejection and violence for breaking boundaries. In the world of urban India that I know best, images of womanhood proliferate, with individual women finding themselves located simultaneously in seemingly contradictory discourses. A part of their self is negotiating being a daughter of a caring mother, registering also her losses as she struggles to find a balance between her care for her daughter's well-being and the demands of being a good wife. Another part is struggling with issues of body image in an act of surveillance of the self, searching for sexual exploration, yet wary of the dangers inherent in it. While the trauma of violence is one aspect of psychological distress, mental health issues often emerge from nameless absences and fraught identifications that seem difficult to organize into a livable self. This should not, of course, imply that mental health concerns are not equally significant in the lives of men and those who do not identify with the gendered binaries of men and women. I'm also well aware of the limitation of speaking of women outside of their multiple social and other locations. The bridging of the terms mental health and women clearly does not also imply the absence of reason or capacity amongst women. Clearly, then, to speak of the mental health of women is to reflect upon the relationships between the structuring of subjectivity within social worlds in ways that produce forms of psychological distress and the emergence of symptoms that simultaneously point towards distress and protest. That many women survive, thrive, and have become primary persons in the engagement with mental health is what enables a discussion such as this one. Indeed, I cannot imagine my own struggles with distress without my many women friends and family, my therapists, and the words of feminist writers across the world. The idea of mental health has gained acceptability and popularity in the last decade within India. Deepika Padukone comes immediately to mind as a spokesperson for awareness of mental health. The opening of this space for conversations on vulnerability is a significant moment in the Indian context. Yet the figure we see is of an incredibly beautiful and articulate upper-class woman. She epitomizes survival, but one which may seem unattainable to many others. In other accounts too, I hear of people searching for ways to look after their mental health. Always somewhat suspicious when a radical idea becomes too popular, I believe that the term mental health needs some analysis, particularly from the perspective of women. I hope at the end to be able to make the point that while psychological distress is an inevitable aspect of human life, for women, the feminist slogan that the personal is political is nowhere more evident than in our engagements with questions of psychological suffering. Although often thought to be the purview of psychologists, psychiatrists, neurologists, and others, in reality, the terrain can best be understood through a highly interdisciplinary perspective that draws from sociology, feminism, psychoanalysis, disability theory, as well as movements such as the LGBTQ, the global mental health movement, disability movement, and the perspectives of survivors. The terrain of mental health requires a nuanced understanding from the perspective of women. In view of these, it may be useful to share the structure of this talk quickly. Briefly, I will break up the talk into 4 sections. The first one being a discussion of the idea of mental health. I will then look briefly at the reconceptualization of questions of mental health in the last 2 decades, and then follow this up with a question of women's subjectivity in India before attempting some discussion on policy. So in terms of the idea of mental health, you will have noticed that I have placed mental health in inverted commas for the sake of this talk. Let me clarify from the start that in doing so, I am not denying the very real question of a form of suffering that has been labeled diversely across time. Acknowledging the reality of psychological distress, I will nevertheless take a critical look at the key terms mental and health. As far as back as 1948, the WHO defined the term health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Adding to this, mental health is defined as a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stressors of life, can work productively, and contribute to the community. Inclusion of social and mental in the idea of health has paved the way for much progressive thinking, directing attention to mental health and illness, as well as an attempt to shift the discourse from one of pathology to positive attainment. One might then be rather well physically, but suffering from a difficulty in another domain, one we have learned to call the domain of the mental. Yet, although we call it mental health, difficulties in mental health include problems that are quite often expressed as somatic or bodily symptoms. A large part of the history of contemporary reflections on the problems of mental illness go back to discussions on hysteria, a disorder where the deepest of psychic distress lodged itself in the bodies of women as failures to speak, see, and move. In women in particular, lack of appetite, weight loss, pain in the back, head or legs, gastrointestinal difficulties, and many others are understood to be physical manifestations of psychological distress. The presence of these somatic symptoms clearly reveals the difficulties posed by the dualism inherent in the idea of mind and body. One might then interrogate the category of the mental, both for the inherent split between mind and body that it implies, and at a deeper level for the fact that it both stands in for and negates a relationship with the brain. At best, the mind refers to the functional qualities associated with the anatomical structure called the brain. In the context of disability, Margaret Price refers to the idea of body-mind to reflect upon this problematic. But we find that phenomenological term experience or the psychosocial category of subjectivity might do as well, but would perhaps unsettle the proximate relationship between mental health and biomedicine. Like the term mental, the idea of health also poses difficulties. Experientially, psychological difficulties do not always express themselves as suffering. Women's lives may seem healthy when they go on functioning in the face of severe violence and abuse, seemingly lacking the entitlement to express their sorrow and rage, the expression of which may be a sign of relative health. In manic episodes too, the person may experience elation and power that is judged to be a form of illness because it deviates from some aspect of reality. In our times, widespread insensitivity masquerades as health, raising questions of how one should understand the absence of distress or apparent well-being in the face of so much suffering. These questions have been asked repeatedly by critical thinkers, especially after the experience of fascism in Germany. Although Freud has often been thought of as a pessimist, his formulation that one could best expect to convert depression into ordinary sadness is a reminder of the fact that health includes our sensitivity to the problems of others. The Buddhist foregrounding of suffering too comes to mind here. It is also the case that there is a close relationship between social suffering and mental health. Asked about the distinction, Arthur Kleinman, anthropologist and leading voice in the field of mental health, writes, the term mental health was developed to encompass not only dementia, psychosis, and depression or anxiety disorders, but also to include a wider set of problems from substance abuse, serious school failure, and family breakdown to violence and its traumatic consequences. In extending the reach of authorized mental health categories to include both clear-cut disease and vaguer, though no less serious problems of everyday life, as well as non-medical catastrophes, the term mental health became an unwieldy, even an unbelievable odd lot. With hundreds of categories, it seems to simultaneously trivialize the most serious of medical conditions and to medicalize social problems. He says, I predict that by 50 years from now, the term mental health will have been abandoned. Nevertheless, the problem it represents, the distinction between the normal and the pathological, will remain diffused since there is a considerable overlap between suffering and mental illness. The process of distinguishing between this apparent normal and seemingly pathological formed the terrain of diagnosis. Among the thinkers I have grown up on, from Sars and Lang to Foucault and Hacking, diagnosis has been viewed with suspicion. It does seem to be the case that, with the exception of some broad categories, social constructions have a role to play in the production of disorders. Eating disorders prevalent amongst women is an example of the very complex processes through which a disorder acquires a place, not only in systems of classification, but in the experience of women. Anorexia, that is real enough to lead to death, is a product of media-created images of slim bodies that represent a controlled femininity that simultaneously resists the idea of the maternal and the body that consumes. It seems that the combination of particular psychological conflicts and the availability of the subject position of a desirable yet not quite womanly body is required for anorexia to emerge. In the past, as is well known, homosexuality was thought to be a disorder. Today, obesity is. Gender too is central to the naming of disorders. And several have reference to women, such as postnatal depression, indicative of the processes of normalization inherent in some diagnostic formulations. From the perspective of a user, diagnostics is enabling if it allows for better treatment chosen from a variety and with consent. As Pratiksha Sharma and others who speak of the question of recovery point out, that more often than not, diagnosis becomes a trap that you cannot exit once you have entered. This is perhaps not the space for such a discussion, but the close relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the diagnostic framework has been a matter of concern, especially for women who have often been medicated for resisting cultural expectations. In the last, new conceptions of psychological distress. While the experience of psychological distress is highly subjective, within the field of psychiatry and most traditions of psychology, a diagnosis becomes central to the understanding of the experience and the classification of the distress for the sake of treatment. Traditionally, disorders were broadly classified as those that were largely biological in their etiology. These included schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, dementia, etc. Other disorders such as depression, anxiety, phobia, and obsessional disorders were thought to have their origins in traumatic experiences, inappropriate patterns of learning and thinking, and difficulties within the self. The former also came to be thought of as severe mental disorders, and the latter as common disorders. The increased concern with mental health has resulted in several new initiatives over the last 2 decades, mostly led by the WHO and what is now called the Global Mental Health Group. These changes are significant in working away from the idea of mental illness to that of psychosocial disability. A critical moment here has been the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. The CRPD grants equal recognition before the law to all persons with disability, including what has traditionally been called mental illness. The Indian Mental Health Act of 2017 states the requirement for an alignment with the CRPD as one of the processes that pushed the act. Mental health has also been included in the SDGs. This reflects the understanding that the idea of mental health includes a wide range of experiences ranging from mild, time-limited distress to chronic, progressive, and severely disabling conditions with considerable expression of mental difficulty, considerable difference in the expression of mental difficulties across communities and cultures. Further, the mental health of each individual is a unique product of social and environmental influences, in particularly during the early life course, interacting with genetic, neurodevelopmental, and psychological processes and affecting biological pathways in the brain. The neat classification into disorders with a biological origin and those that arise from trauma is now questioned, with early childhood trauma and sociocultural events such as migration, poverty, and natural disasters being considered causative. The new conception also requires a rights-based approach to protect the welfare of people with mental disorders and those who face vulnerabilities or risk factors associated with poor mental health, and to enable an environment that promotes mental health for all. Vikram Patel and his colleagues are, of course, instrumental in this whole process. The global mental health movement acknowledges the wide suffering caused by mental illness across the globe. Worldwide statistics suggest that perhaps a sixth of the population suffers from forms of mental illness. In India, the NMHS indicates that 13.9% of the Indian population currently suffers from mental illness. We know of both the circular relationship between mental illness and poverty and a bidirectional relationship with physical illness, being both an antecedent and a consequence of it. Clearly, hierarchy in societal locations is implied in the incidence of mental illness. Women, unsurprisingly, are therefore more likely to experience some kinds of mental health issues. Women's subjectivity and the context of India. As feminists show, there is something impossible about the discursive construction of womanhood. Women's bodies and sexuality are out of control, yet desired. She's expected to be desirable to the right extent and in the right place. Her own desire is often a sign of either her badness or her madness. Compulsory heterosexuality is the norm. And in India, she must want to be a mother, a position that is apparently empowering, but the power is attainable only if she gives birth to an able-bodied son. If she's given access to education, she must learn but not change. She must go out to work but give the earnings to the family. She must maintain timings and be safe. She still finds herself living in a very unsafe world and is often held responsible for the violence that she encounters. Women's bodies are the continual subject of scrutiny and discussion, even as they are expected to fit in, sometimes with one ideal and at other times with another. Of course, the control of sexuality has been central to our heritage, with much of the system of marriage organized to maintain chastity and caste purity. Despite the obvious difficulties, symbolic and material, including food deprivation and so on, and as Professor Patel said, lack of jobs, lack of financial resource, and so on, so material and symbolic, the question of subjectivity and distress has rarely been the center of the agenda for the women's movement. As Bhargavi Davar says in an interview at Belong, if biomedicine and diagnosis have been one end of the complexities involved in discussion of mental health, the failure to recognize the reality of distress is the other. Unfortunately, the women's movement in India has been slow to recognize the reality or the concerns of women with disability. The refusal of the women's movement to accept the problem of psychological distress seems to come from the belief that the framework of rights and an analysis of social oppression is sufficient to overcome distress. In doing so, feminists have perhaps unwittingly aligned themselves with the perspective of the autonomous, able-bodied subject with the rational mind. The problem of psychological distress that can become disabling and the woman who encounters it are both rendered outside and in shame. In fact, many of the institutional spaces that should be supportive of women's growth and the articulation of their selves are experienced as lacking. As the first space where children encounter both love and power, images from the family, often unconscious, form a significant part of us. Unfortunately, too many women are uncertain that they were wanted or loved. Too many have seen their father's violence against their mothers. This may take the form of shaming and derogatory speech, criticisms of the body, possessiveness, and the withholding of monetary resources, marital rape, and beating. Clinical experiences repeatedly reveal the trauma associated with the viewing of such abuse. In terms of their own emerging subjectivities, it leaves children confused the nature of gender and of intimacy and of their place in the ensuing violence, where they sometimes take up the role of the protector, feeling guilty and anxious as they witness this. Children themselves are often abused physically and sexually, predisposing them to later episodes of trauma. The family's gatekeeping of a woman's sexuality is also a source of distress amongst young women. Paradoxically, the need to hide enhances their difficulty, pushing them towards unsafe sex, abortions, and violence. Bhargavi Davar, writing from 1999 onwards, discusses, or well earlier actually, discusses the mental health of women in India from a feminist perspective. In her analysis, she returns to the distinction between severe and common mental disorders, although she has moved away from this in recent writing. As she points out, after a detailed review of epidemiological studies, there is little difference in the extent of mental illness between men and women when it comes to the severe mental disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, and so on. This is a finding that is generally replicated. Common mental disorders such as depression, anxiety, phobia are seen more often in married women, a fact that Davar accounts for in terms of the coexistence of violence and the function of providing care. For women, at least those from upper caste Hindu families, but perhaps also elsewhere, there is a pervasive sense of homelessness and exile. The homes where they are born do not always welcome them back if their lives after marriage are dissatisfying or violent. Continuous violence leaves a woman deeply scarred, unsure of what she must do to prevent it. Such helplessness and perhaps a rage that cannot find easy expression create the conditions for mental illness. Phenomenologically, it is not surprising that a woman who is never sure when she may encounter violence will be anxious. Her inability to see a way out can create depression. She is unlikely to feel worthy of love and care. She may not even want to live. The situation is complicated by women's socialization and self-definition as caretakers. The combination of continuous caregiving without reciprocity is psychologically draining, particularly when it may not be desired. There's barely any recognition of the fact that not all women want to be mothers. I have often found myself wondering if some of the postnatal depression that women experience is not a melancholic response to a role that they did not want or were not ready for, and one which is difficult to express. Dr. Amrita Nandy, who is here with us, has written about child-free women, but the space for this choice, while increasing, remains small. Increasingly, men have also vacated the space of elder care, increasing the care burden on women. In this context, the recent provision of childcare leave is a welcome step, but is available only to those in formal spaces of work and only for the restricted domain for care for the child. The care of aging parents and others does not count as care. Even where families may be more positive spaces, women find themselves facing violence and abuse in multiple locations, from schools, playgrounds, streets, and campuses, workspaces, and in situations of political conflict. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the freedom and safety required for mental health are often missing from women's lives. Ideally, the psychological well-being of women requires widespread changes in most institutional spaces. At a more micro level, the acceptance of a woman's despair and anger is an important step towards her well-being. Psychological distress, while lacking the agency of political critique, does contain an element of protest. The despair that accompanies the protest comes from feelings of anxiety and guilt, and an injunction towards silence, particularly with regards to those you have loved. The fact that women are socialized to be relational means that the other's gaze is more often taken within. For women, then, there are often moments of confusion about who they are and what they want. This is critical to the question of mental health, and one where practitioners may have varied points of view. I have used the word symptom earlier, deliberately to refer to a feeling of being somewhat unwell, somewhat distressed that emerges in the face of unknown conflicts and stresses. Quite recently, someone called me to say she felt something was not right, but she had no clue to what it was. Should this nameless quality get quickly medicalized in a bid to restore health, or might it turn out to be a springboard for mental health? A voice within her asking herself if this is what she really wants. This voice is a source of resistance to the dominant descriptions of womanhood in our world. In the many spaces of research, teaching, and conversations around me, I have found that women do not look for alternative spaces and new narratives of themselves. I have found that women do look for alternative spaces and new narratives of themselves. We found these in the women who called us on the helpline during the pandemic at Ehsaas, in our clinic at AUD, and even in the narratives that unfold during research processes. In a sense, then, the feminist vision of mental health must make space for psychological crises and minor disruptions of functioning. It is an engagement with crises that will generate the capacity to imagine and dream beyond the dominant descriptions of idealized and socially appropriate womanhood. Our experience suggests that after the initial distress, women are often able to visualize a new life for themselves. Sometimes the distress will pass off even after a few conversations. When scars are deeper, it may need time that we must rest in a neoliberal world. I will now move to a little bit to the question of policy. I would say here that my work has been informed by many scholars, Bhargavi Davar, whom I have already referred to, Renu Adlakha, Professor Amita Dhanda, Pratiksha, Reshma, and Professor Anita Ghai, Professor Hani Oberoi, and others. I'm not really a policy person, but on the question of mental health, I do feel that there is, in some senses, I think the point I'm making about safety, about freedom, about access, these are extremely significant to mental health because these are what create the potential for positive well-being in everyone and including women. However, leaving that aside for the moment, there are several points I would like to make. First of all, it has been widely commented that the Mental Health Act of 2017 is in the right direction, but it is not sufficient. There is a greater need for clarity on the rights of people with serious psychosocial disabilities. And I should also say at this moment of time that perhaps when we are discussing policy, we may actually have to think in two ways. We may have to think across what Bhargavi would call the mental health spectrum, right? Of a whole range of difficulties that may be from very transient and very minor to quite chronic and quite disabling. So in some ways, we need to think together of all of these issues, but at another level, we need to think separately. So when we think separately, we do realize that the budget allocations on all aspects of health, including those of mental health, need vast enhancement in India. The WHO states that in India, there are 0.3 psychiatrists per 1 lakh people, 0.7 psychologists, 0.07 psychologists, and 0.07 social workers, while the desirable number is much, much higher than this. If women do experience chronic or serious debilitating psychosocial disability, mental illness, call it whatever you want to, they do not actually have access to psychiatric care, to good hospitalization, or to even a small community-based, a local health center with a once-a-week availability of a psychiatrist. So that is one serious problem. And I do think also that it is important to bring in survivors and users into the decision-making process, particularly women with a feminist orientation. Advocacy around the contemporary understanding of psychosocial disabilities, particularly of a more severe nature, are required. We will need health policies which are flexible and person-centered. We also need to work within the provisions of the CRPD, particularly in the context of the question of legal capabilities. That is the question of who will decide which kind of treatment, particularly a woman suffering from severe psychosocial disability, should get. This is, of course, a very difficult problem to work with. Once again, I will cite the Seher model that has been developed by Bhargavi Dawar as one example of the kind in which a kind of community support is developed, a circle of care is developed that provides relatively autonomous yet supported living within a framework of choice and consent. In terms of policy, we also significantly need to work when it comes to those with severe psychosocial disabilities on their representations in the media. They seem to be represented quite often as homicidal or, odd, which is in marked contrast to our experience of, living and working with people who have these kinds of disabilities. We have also, of course, to think about the question of psychological distress across the multiple locations that women occupy in India. And I do think that as people associated with universities, we need to facilitate more research. Perhaps it would be interesting to have situated ethnographies that foreground distress and resilience amongst women from different locations. As I think of the present, it seems to me not very difficult to imagine that the controversy over hijab may have left several Muslim girls in a state of heightened anxiety and stress. Similarly, for Dalit women, violence in public spaces may make that a greater difficulty for them than the violence within the family. Beyond all this, I feel that a lot of work needs to be done to alleviate the suffering for the many, many women who in fact are suffering from what used to be called the common mental disorders, that is depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, phobias, and so on and so forth. And here I have been a bit worried, and those of us at AUD have tried but failed to gain recognition for the category of the psychotherapist. The Mental Health Act 2017, in fact, does not give recognition to the psychotherapist, while all over the world, psychotherapists work and have been found to be effective in assisting people in distress without medication, simply through establishing a relational context and working therapeutically. At AUD, Ehsaas provides therapy that is either free or at a very low cost for a very long period of time. And we have a huge waiting list. Unfortunately, we are going through a crisis in the sense that at the moment, we do not have that many therapists working for us. We do not have the funding for that. But for the longest time we did, and we have huge waiting lists, and we have worked with very seriously disturbed people, both women and men. Perhaps at least 100 people with suicidal tendencies have worked with us in the last few years. Apart from that, I think that we need to work towards creating group work with women. We also need to work on the training of lay counselors from local communities, people who have been selected from villages or small towns because they seem to have the capacity to empathize and to listen, to give them some fundamental training, and then to use them as facilitators of mental health in their own local areas. Suicide rates are very high in school and institutions of higher education, and this is the age group of adolescence, and young adulthood is extremely vulnerable. I therefore feel that both universities and schools must be equipped with extremely high quality counselors and psychotherapists. But importantly, it is also significant that though they be allowed to work autonomously, not as people whose job is to maintain the structure, but in fact, people whose job is to listen to the distress of the students. From the accounts I have from my students who have been to work in as school counselors, most schools will not allow the student to sit with a counselor for more than 15 minutes at a time. And this is clearly not enough for the development of the kind of relationship that is required for assisting in distress situations. Repeatedly, I feel that this is a significant problem, probably all over the world, but in India, that structures of authority, such as the family and the school, are not subject to critique, even though they do frequently cause psychosocial problems and distress, right? So I think that's a very important aspect. I also feel that, this is another controversial area, but my own conviction is that spaces which provide healing experiences through spirituality and religion should not be universally banned. I do think that there is a need for some protection against abuse, but that is true for all institutions, right? Even in universities, even in hospitals. I mean, the Irrawaddy episode is talked about so often, but during COVID, several hospitals caught fire and so many patients died, right? But the treatment of those hospitals was not the same as the treatment of these, indigenous sites. So I think that I seem to have said a lot, not really in the domain in which Professor Patel was pointing, but hopefully not contradicting her either. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rachana Johri. You have given a very, very comprehensive view. You also spoke about how the patriarchal control over women's sexuality creates a major psychological barrier among the women in terms of self-esteem, self-confidence, and also the mental makeup that they have. Education, where a very, very, very poignant reality that you learn but don't change. I think that is also causing major contradiction, and also right-based approach, which you talked about, and also socialization, the role of socialization, and the decision-making power of survivor. And I think that I would like to connect with our experience in the women's movement, that during 80s, when women's groups started providing support to survivor of violence, I think the decision-making was a very important element. Women's movement provided fresh inputs in terms of individual and group counseling, and also consciousness-raising exercise that we all had. Otherwise, all of us would have been in mental asylum by now. It was the women's movement and the collective consciousness we arrived at, which allowed us to get rid of so many patriarchal baggages, and also the self-limiting attitude that we had about ourselves, and the self-concept that we had, and the mutual counseling that enabled us to share experiences, problems, feelings, dreams, utopia, action plan for rebuilding the shattered lives in a non-threatening environment that it provided. And this feminist consciousness allowed us to recognize that what we perceive as personal problems are shared with others in a non-power oriented atmosphere. So I think this is one very important learning. And I think you also gave some of the examples where these elements are still there in a community-based support system that is created by certain organizations, and Bhargavi Davar's experience, and the whole consciousness raising, which can be seen as enabling women to overcome false consciousness. I think that is also very important, and how we become self-dependent decision makers, and also emotionally self-reliant that we become in this process. And Aparna Joshi has directly worked, because I visited Bapu Trust when Aparna was heading, she was the face of Sehat project. I would like to ask Aparna that your journey began with Seher project, but now you have expanded your work both in terms of intensity and the scope and the canvas that you are covering through your Center for Human Ecology. Would you like to share your experiences and what are the learnings in terms of micro, meso, and the macro level policy intervention?
Sure. So do I go in the order first, or do I, because the order that was shared, I think I went last, but if I'm permitted, I can jump in
no,
here.
because the way she spoke, I did not have concept note from
Thank you
Professor
so
Johri.
much.
So I think
Yeah,
it connects directly because she
thank
has
you so much.
evaluated
Sure,
Seher
yeah.
3-4 times in her
Thanks a lot.
presentation.
Thanks a
That's
lot.
why.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. So I think thank you, Vibhuti, for giving me this opportunity. And first of all, I think congratulations to Professor Rachana for such a comprehensive coverage of the topic. And I'm going to perhaps, repeat some of the themes, but I'll also try to keep it fresh. And definitely, I think, Vibhuti, what you have asked me to do is to talk from an interventionist perspective. And at heart, I'm an interventionist. So I'll try to sort of, present my thoughts in that manner. Let me just first position myself as to, and give you an outline of what is it that I plan to speak today. So first of all, as I said, that I am an academician, but I'm also a researcher, a trainer, a therapist myself. And I'm hardcore interventionist at heart because I'm always interested in conceptualizations which are applicable, which help people solve problems also at some level, or which help find solutions. And of course, I'm somebody who is herself, I identify as a cis woman. I'm a client to my therapist. So I'm wearing multiple hats, and I'm going to talk whatever little small, sharing that I need to do from all of these positionalities. So I'm going to talk about quickly touch upon 4 points. The first one is why is it important to connect women or gender issues with mental health quickly? How to conceptualize women's mental health, and third is how do I understand about women's ideas of mental health? Who is the right person to talk about women's mental health? And the fourth thing, as I said, I'm an interventionist at heart, so I would definitely like to talk about some responses that are quickly required, right? So I will try my level best to avoid what has already been shared. But I think it always helps as an academician to give some numbers, so it appears more academic, and you have read and done some job. So we are talking about large numbers, whether we accept the reality of mental illness, the labels or not. We are talking about large numbers of distress, as in 1 in 4 people across the world having some kind of mental health distress or concern, and particularly women overrepresenting almost twice the number in categories such as depression, or what was earlier called, and even global mental health continues to call today, as common mental disorders such as anxiety disorder, somatoform disorder, or your PTSD, post-traumatic disorder. Again, I don't want to quickly jump into the whole problematization of label or diagnosis, but these are the numbers that are available. And I've had the opportunity to work directly with women through 2 projects that I'm a therapist, so I've been practicing for 25 years. But currently I run 2 projects at TISS. One is called iCALL, which is one of the leading national level helplines. It's a multilingual, professionally run helpline, but it is completely free of cost for all people across the lifespan. And young people and women are some of the key demographics who call us. And the second project I run is known as Sukoon, whereby we provide psychosocial counseling in legal structures to people who come to legal structures for addressing matrimonial issues. So through both these projects, I've had the opportunity to have very close dialogues. And the COVID pandemic also has brought forth the issue of mental health, which was considered to be the issue of only a few. The numbers, for example, in India, say 170 million people in India are in need of some kind of mental health service. And earlier it was considered only it is the issue of those 170 million. But COVID made it very, very clear that nobody is spared from the mental health impact. While it was called an equalizer, it was also very, very clear that it was not an equalizer, but in fact, it brought the pre-existing rifts and the pre-existing disparities of the society, and women were one of the worst affected members because of COVID. Now, having said that, my next question quickly, I would want to jump into what is the connection between gender and mental health? Now, gender can be conceptualized to intersect with mental health 4 ways. One is gender is a very critical determinant of stressors that people experience, the kind of stressors and unique realities women experience. And I'm being very, very clear that we are working within gender binary of women and men, which I don't believe in. Secondly, I'm also very, very clear that while I am talking about women as if they are a monolithic identity, they are not. Yeah, there are certain vulnerabilities within vulnerabilities also, and let me clarify that. But the unique stressors that women experience across the lifespan is a very, very critical determinant. And those, I don't have to repeat, I think Professor Rachana has made a fantastic presentation about these unique life realities. The second point where gender and mental health intersects for women is definitely to do with gendered manifestations of the kind of mental health concerns they experience, which means when it comes to severe mental disorders, again, if we take the reality of mental disorders, equal. But if you particularly look at common mental disorders, there is a very close connection between violence, disempowerment, lack of access to education and other resources. And therefore, women highly overrepresent men as compared to, in these categories of common disorders. The third intersection point where gender is a very critical determinant is help-seeking patterns and utilization of mental health services. You will typically find women, given their resources, given the deprioritization of women's mental health, can reach maximum up till primary health care or a doctor, whereas men will have access to tertiary care or hospital facilities. Also, there is a very, very clear research which shows that being a woman is a very high predictor of being given psychotropic medication. So just because you are a woman, you are likely to receive a quick diagnosis and a quick medication also. And the fourth point where being a woman intersects with mental health is the consequences of mental health concerns. If you are a man and if you have mental health problems, there is a very, very high chance in a country like India. For example, if you look at research from Tata, from SCARF, or other, very, very prominent researchers who have studied schizophrenia, they will tell you that if you are a man with severe mental illness or any mental illness, possibility of being cared for is very, very high because the caregiver is a woman. Whereas if you are a woman who is suffering from mental illness, the possibility of being cared is very, very minimal. In fact, the possibility of being deserted and divorced is very, very high. Yeah. There are numbers across India which are telling us. So gender is a very critical determinant at these 4 intersecting points. The next question I quickly want to explore, which Professor Rachana has already explored, is conceptualization of women's mental health. And I think continues to be still biomedical, which limits women's mental health to their bodies, largely to their reproductive systems. And it's a very cunning conspiracy because it situates it within them, within their psyches, within their bodies, and within their individual selves. But the interaction between the individual and these socio-contextual realities is very cleverly forgotten. And therefore, it's very important. I don't want to deny the role of biology. I don't want to deny the role of self, but I want to emphasize the role of socio-contextual realities because the solutions are linked with the conceptualization. It is also very, very important that in recent times, conceptualizations have not only moved from biomedical to socio-contextual, but also to disability, the social model of disability. That it is not the person, it is not the environment, but the person-environment fit, which creates disabilities within people. And therefore, it is equally a responsibility of the society, the policy, the government, and the environment to provide a very, very conducive environment and not to label women and leave them to fend after their own mental health. So having looked at these conceptualizations, quickly I want to answer the last two questions is, how do we know best about women's realities and women's mental health? The answer is, it can't be expert driven. It can't be me or somebody else talking about that. It has to, and it can't be only positivist, decontextualized and objective method of knowing, but it has to be subjective, locally contextualized, and nothing about us without us. It has to come from women.
That's important.
Right?
Yeah.
It can't come from experts. It is also important to remember here, while we are talking to women, to understand how they conceptualize mental health, what do they want, what do they find helpful. Women are not monolithic identity. There are vulnerabilities within vulnerabilities, and there are silences and omissions. As a cis woman, I'm here. But I don't know whether as a trans woman, as a person with disability, as a person from certain geographies, languages, I'm talking in English, I don't know who all can represent platforms like this. So there are vulnerabilities nested within vulnerabilities. And if we want to understand from women, we need to understand women in its entirety and understand from them what do they consider as mental health and what do they need. And the last question quickly I want to answer is, what is it that needs to be done? Because as I said that I'm an interventionist at heart. We live in very, very interesting times today. We have progressive mental health policy. We have a progressive legislation, both the mental health legislation as well as the disability legislation. We have a slightly archaic national mental health program, but still overall, we have the finance minister who has announced 23 telemedicine and a huge budget also. I don't know what's going to happen, but may we live in interesting times. So what do we need to do? One is, whatever program policy we devise, it has to be aware of socio-contextual realities and not just biomedical or intrapsychic and individual realities of women's lives. Secondly, it is also very, very important that those programs and policies need to simultaneously engage with women's internal as well as external and material realities. They need to simultaneously engage with women's personal as well as political realities. Yeah. And detached or divorced, sorry to use a very heterosexual married kind of a word, realities are not going to be very, very beneficial for any programs. It has to have inclusion of women in all decision making. User survivors have to be at the center, driving seat of some of these decisions. Gender is not just an health issue. I just want to please say that it's almost that the entire responsibility of mental health is relegated to health ministry. Whereas I find that gender is a cross-cutting issue across all development programs. You take women in child department, you take youth development department, you talk about adolescent health program, you talk about youth empowerment, economic development, gender and mental health have to be, because there is somebody, mental health is not just a mental health practitioners or policymakers issues. It is everybody's issues. Therefore, it has to be a cross-cutting theme. And the last 3 points I want to make is the response has to be community-based. Given the disparity that Professor Rachana has talked about in a country like 170 million and less than 9,000 professionals in each category, we can never, ever fix that gap. And we don't need that. Even WHO also says that most of the mental health problems or concerns require non-clinical solutions, which means we require community-engaged responses and we require responses which are rights-based. But last two things I need to say, it needs to include not just women, but men and other stakeholders.
I meant to say that.
Always with the converted. So we need to talk to different stakeholders. And the last thing is, when we talk to people who are providing care, we need to always keep in mind that please, our programs need to care for those who offer care also. Yeah. Right. Otherwise, we will never have robust structures which will really reach out to address women's mental health. So thank you once again for giving me this opportunity, and I'm waiting to hear from others also. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Aparna Joshi. I think I liked your this thing, nothing about us without us. In Vacha, we say nothing about girls without girls. So that is our organization slogan. But I think you talked about the socio-contextual reality and the material reality of women is very important. And also the community-based engagement, and also involving including man also and all stakeholders is a very well taken. Now I would like to ask Dr. Cicilia Chettiar, you work with the girls from underprivileged background, multiple hardships they face in this thing. How do you, as a teacher of psychology, and you are also you are interventionist, you are not only just a teacher in the classroom, but you also, what are your experiences? And last 2 years, the kind of work you have done proactively, can you share some of the learnings of those experiences?
Thank you, Vibhuti ma'am. I will answer your questions very, very directly because it's exactly what I was planning to talk about. Professor Johri, I so loved listening to you because you touched upon so many points that I wanted to talk about. With your permission, I will also perhaps elaborate a little more on what you spoke about, reconceptualization of distress and women's subjectivity in India. But I'll start off with what Dr. Aparna Joshi spoke about in terms of what do we do? What is the action plan? So yes, it is community-based mental health. I think we have to make it now a people's movement. There's something wonderful that we have started in our college. The education system wants us to upskill our graduates and provide skill development. And we started an emotional skill development program for our students. So for the past 3 years, we have been running a psychology-based skill development program where we consider the focus to be emotional upskilling. And being a women's college, our students are trained to deal with, of course, the normal, to recognize patriarchal norms, because for a long time, they don't even realize that this is not normal. There's another term, Professor Johri used, normal stressors. We have normalized the stressors. Like, ma'am, shaadi to karni hai, ma'am, aisa to hoga hi. Like, I have to suffer. It's just a given. The fact that we have normalized it, these questions have to be first brought out to the surface and then presented to the students so that they can answer whether they want to make this a stressor in their lives. There was quite a bit of discussion about whether you should be married or not. Being a single woman, should I have a child? It's normalized. I have to get married. I have to have kids. I have to give up my education. And with the pandemic, the standard problems that everyone has spoken about. One mobile phone in the house, there's a son and a daughter, the mobile phone will go to the son. We don't need our daughter to get educated. Daughter needs to help in the house because the working mother is too busy working online, so she can't take care of the family responsibilities.
Even the vaccination for the girls.
Vaccination first for the boys.
95% girls were coming to college because their vaccination was not treated as a priority.
Not treated as a priority, exactly. So that's when women, the girls, young girls started asking us, what are we doing about this? And the girls who we saw through this program since the past 3 years, fortunately, this program had come up before the pandemic. We saw that they were dealing with their emotional situation far better. And they were excellent supporters to their classmates who had still, or the other department peers who hadn't gone through the program. So yes, it has to be a people movement and we can't just wait for policies. Policies have their place, but we need to start right at the very basic level, make it a part of your educational system. And as Dr. Aparna said, don't just educate the girls, educate the boys too. They are also the recipients of stigma. They also suffer as a result of this because of the expectations, patriarchal systems. It's very simple topics we took: emotional regulation, resilience, substance abuse, and sexuality. So many girls are now questioning, do I have to get married? What if I'm feeling attracted to some other woman? And it is okay, the normal cisgender definition, there is a question mark. Another great movement that we have in our institute, which we're proud of, is a student-run cell called Satrangi Hak Se. Students are demanding clarity about their sexual orientation and they want to talk to each other about it without judgment from the teachers even. So it's a program entirely run by the students where the teachers are not allowed. Even during the pandemic, they had their own online sessions, an entire social media campaign running for it. These are women coming together for women in the, in the sense of male woman, but we also have so many victories. I'm so happy to be proclaiming this. We've had women who, thanks to these movements like Satrangi Hakse, have stepped forward and said that I'm stepping away from this traditional definition of a woman that has been assigned to me. And we've had students who are saying that I'm quitting this definition. They have come out during programs and said that I am not a cisgender woman. I prefer to refer to myself as a trans woman, or that I am bisexual, or that I have other interests. And they are doing this bravely because there is no judgment, which connects us again to the point of normal stressors, that we will be judged, we will be questioned, and this entire process where being the superwoman is normalized. You have to be a woman who's good at everything, and if you are not good at everything, then there is something wrong with you. And this is an expectation which women have from women, and somewhere, perhaps I'm wrong, but somewhere feminism has contributed in ways that women have misinterpreted and misunderstood what it means to be a feminist. And they think being a feminist means just doing whatever you want, without regard for personal safety, without regard for personal care, because I just want to rebel. And it's not just because they are youngsters, they are at that age when they will rebel. No, it is because they have been told a very different story where basic concepts have not been explained to them. And all these social contexts, all these social situations are interfering with their ability to step forward and take a simple decision of whether I want to study, whether I want to quit, whether I want to work, whether I want to put myself first. The entire conceptualization of what is psychological distress is now at the mercy of, am I following the norms which I didn't even know were norms? I thought it was my essential reality. And that is what we are facing in the college, to awaken, so to speak, our young women to question. And with the associated economic stresses that came along with the pandemic, the pressure is still on the girls to take up a job. Simple thing like giving tuitions. Why can't your brother take tuitions for the other kids to add to the income? No, he's not patient, he can't do it, I will have to do it. So the pressure of studying, looking after the house, providing for the family income. So adding to the family income, though you're a girl, is normal. But if you want the mobile phone for your studies, is not normal. And it's okay. So there's also a challenge over here when we are raising their awareness and we're telling them, ask these questions, and they realize that this is not normal, this is not okay. The first hit that they get, the first hit to their psychological composure that they get is that, oh my God, I've been taken advantage of by people whom I trusted, by people who are considered to be my family. And here comes the institute. The institute needs to support. As you spoke, counselors need to be independent. They have to be functioning on their own, but it is not going to happen. No matter how well-intentioned you are, either the counselor's salaries are not coming in, or there is not enough time because the pressure is, oh, she barely attends lectures. And even when she's coming to college, why am I going to send her to the counselor's office? A lot of support can be generated by private individuals, by CSR. In fact, our counseling cell again is running independently because it is sponsored by an independent foundation, and the institution has taken a hands-off approach saying we will not interfere. So there are possibilities, there are things that are happening where we are. My first step, I think a lot of discussion is happening on how can we deal with the problem. But at the college level, we are first realizing that women don't even recognize, our young girls don't even recognize that it is not okay. You don't have to be a superwoman all the time, that if you're feeling upset and you're tired, the normal term which is used for our young girls a lot by their family members, you're so lazy. The judgments of laziness and incompetence which they have made their reality without and therefore affecting their emotional state, not realizing that they are not lazy, they're not incompetent. It has nothing to do with that. It is probably a role they don't identify with. It is probably a task they don't connect with. It is probably a decision that has been imposed on them. It is sometimes just purely lack of energy, low hemoglobin, such basic things they are unaware of. Lack of vitamin D, which we recognize as big turning, it's another epidemic altogether, which also affects your mood. Such basic realities are missing. Yes, everything that you say is correct, and you're talking at a very, very global level. Yes, we have to work at the global level, but let's talk about what is happening on a daily basis. And coming from an institute which represents a group of kids who want to do better, but who don't know how to do better, is it my job to tell them what is better? No, it is just our presence which allows them to come into their own and to be in their system. There's a lot of another interesting statement Professor Johri made about the confusion about the identity and about what is wanted. Here we are finding a lot of confusion with regards to their sexual orientation. They're questioning the standards. They're questioning, why do I have to be in a marriage where I am going to face the normal stressors when I could be in another relationship where I will, of course, have another set of normal stresses, but it will be my choice. So the kind of problems they used to have probably about 30 years ago about intercaste marriage and interreligion marriage is now coming up with orientation and relationships with people of the same orientation. And it is a huge, huge task to hold these people, these young women together, which is why collaborating with agencies which provide the expertise and which can help them in this particular area, so that the students don't feel that my teachers will come to know and they will know exactly what I'm thinking. So creating that anonymous, safe space, non-judgmental, non-threatening space for them. Speaking also as a therapist, the number of clients that we see, of course, I'm not sure if this is the experience of Dr. Aparna too, but very often we see women who come in for therapy far more than men who come in for therapy. And something very interesting, men are constantly ambitious, next step, next step, next step, next step. But with women, they come to a certain space and they're like, okay, now I don't know what to do. And they don't recognize that there is a mental block, which is why the ambition has kind of somewhere petered out, and they're like, oh, I've done all that I could. And this is usually in the 35 to 45 age group, where they feel that, okay, I have done so much, my mother, grandmother, or whoever else is in my circle has not done it. And then the questions of inadequacy, the questions of incompetence, the questions of maybe I'm not being fair to my family. All those questions make them experience a whole set of other disorders. And again, when they come in for therapy, we just raise the simple awareness that, is it really, are you, and the standard statements, oh, I'm always anxious, I'm always depressed, I'm always fighting, my husband tells me I'm always doing kit, my kids tell me that I'm always angry and grumpy. The recognition that this is their stand or their demand for an identity, for a space. And Vibhuti ma'am, you spoke about the glass cliff and the glass ceiling and the glass wall. Technically, they understand it, but they don't realize that some of the walls are the walls that they have erected for themselves, because they have decided, yes, I had thought I will become the general manager, yes, but CEO, no, probably that's not my cup of tea. Not too many people think there, and then starts the judgment, a whole set of disorders. So besides all the diagnostic questions, you know, when DSM-5 came out, one of the jokes was that if you're a woman, you have a disorder as per the DSM-5. Everything was a disorder. You have PMS, you have PTSD, you have postnatal, prenatal, you name it, everything, geriatrics, anything. You are a woman, you have hormones, we don't know what to do with them, so it's a problem. And this particular understanding and this statement was made today by a male psychiatrist. So that was, of course, he was trying to be respectful and say, I don't agree with it, but this is what the story is, the narrative is that has come out. So we want to change the story, but for young women, those of us who work with very young women in schools and colleges, or even in therapy, what I would say for 35 to 45, women at the prime of their lives, what is the narrative that we are offering them? What are we telling them? We're saying, oh, there is a policy, or this is what you should do, or this is what feminism is, or this is what equality is, or this is how mental health has been unfairly linked to gender. And my goal is, or my aim is just to kind of let them know that they are not the best version of themselves, because essentially that's what we are looking for in therapy. Yes, the mental health terminology, we have all their questions, as you raised, Professor Johri, when you spoke about the idea of mental health. But for convenience sake, if I take the concept of mental health, the term, what is wrong if I have certain questions and if I'm not following the norm? If I'm not following the norm, there is something wrong. That's it. I am wrong, I am bad, I am not supposed to be dependable, I don't want a child, so I'm selfish, or I am thinking too much of myself. There's arrogance. That's one of the other gender-based issues, maybe, but that's also become a mental health issue. Oh, she's
And also
not thinking
daily
right.
microaggression, because now everyone in Mumbai is talking about microaggression in the ecosystem. So that coping with the microaggression, no, that the insensitivity of your colleagues
and the term that is also used along with microaggression is, oh, this lady, she has micropsychotic episodes. Micropsychotic episodes. Why? Because she decides to make a stand and she will not take no for an answer or succumb to whatever unfair system is being presented to her. But I have not heard too many people say that this man is having micropsychotic episodes, no matter how much he is flying into a rage and breaking things and being unfair. Yeah, so I'd like to end with this note on what is the narrative that we want to set, not just for our students, for the young women, yes, but also for women all over. That the term very commonly used right now is neurodivergence. A lot of people are using this term. Initially, it was meant to be used only with the spectrum, but people now recognize that you are not functioning in typical ways. So not functioning in typical ways, not typical to the norms as prescribed by society, not typical to the ways a lot of other women have already been following. So that does not mean there's something wrong with you or that you have a disorder. It means that you're different. Hatke, alag hai, whatever those terms we are using, and we are saying it's okay to be different. And I think that is the narrative we need to bring forward if we want to really bring about some equality or bring about some change in the mental health of women. Thank you.
Dr. Cicilia, I think we have also, I would like to add that our girls have also faced a lot of cyber stalking and cyber crime during the last 2 years. I think that has been the universal experience of all the students in schools and colleges. But I think, yeah, brilliant exposition of the problem that you have given. And now, Dr. Amrita Nandy, would you share your experiences and give the response to previous 3 speakers?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Patel. Rachana, that was really such an impressive arc that you drew there. A very impressive trajectory. It was compact yet very valuable. It was, you brought in so many textures of women's psychological health, but you also brought up the backstory of what lies behind and beyond the psychological structures, conditions within which this health emerges. And then you've joined dots with these other discursive sides of femininity, subjectivities, the politics of health. So really, thank you so much for this. And I think I'm an outlier here among therapists, but also a fellow feminist and a researcher. And I'd like to go back to 2 points you made. And really, this is for other discussants, the chair, and not just for you, Rachana. But yeah, I'd like to go back to something very insightful. You put it very beautifully. You said that the problem of mental health for women remains that of finding ways of exploring the world, of finding the self without facing rejection and violence, and how mental health issues emerge from nameless absences or fraught identification. So given this, Rachana, how do we enable young women to know their pain through its very, very subtle and explicit interlinkages with patriarchy's gender? And as you yourself said, women's lives may seem healthy when they go on functioning in the face of very severe violence and abuse. So how do we light the path, help each other take off those masks before the struggles become overwhelmingly difficult, or offer them these vocabularies? And I think Cicilia did a great job of outlining many ways of how this can be done, but I'd love to hear from you and Aparna and Professor Patel. And the other, really my last question, and perhaps you can anticipate this already, is you spoke of the Buddhist foregrounding of suffering and how religious and spiritual sites of healing should be legitimized as necessary spaces. Now, given how fraught the encounter between feminism and the contemplative, or secular and spiritual, not to speak of faith, how can one create a space where these silos could be raised? And how do we draw from, say, the repertoire of Buddhist psychology, since you brought up Buddhism, without having to forego identity, to juggle the self from a point in consciousness where one can alternate between one's gender identity yet loosen the label, the identity? Now, is there work you could point us to? Work not in the secular mindfulness sense, there's plenty of that, but one that draws more fully from, say, Vedantic notions of the self or Buddhist notions of not self? How does one reimagine a politics that marries the feminist with the spiritual? And these questions are really for all of us to deal with. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Amrita Nandy. I think after these 4 very insightful presentations, now the floor is open for question or intervention or expansion or contradicting, whatever. The participants can unmute themselves and speak. Nobody has raised hand, or I don't see anything, any comment in the chat box. So
can I just try to, or actually, I think any one of us can respond to this, Aparna or something. But if you'd like, I can try to respond to Amrita's 2 questions first. I mean, they're both quite complicated, Amrita, and I think perhaps I wrote like that because I was also trying to say that it's not altogether so simple sometimes, right? There is in the mental health arena the problem of, absences, like something I could not feel. I have never felt happy, let us say, right? I did not have my father. It doesn't matter, not having a father doesn't actually matter. But what I'm saying is that at times, because of the dominant social constructions and also the way it is being played out in the intimate lives of people, I think these become like gappy things inside one. It's like lacks that, sometimes you carry with you. And obviously, I agree completely with Cicilia that, especially at the right stage, and in fact, young college students are at a good stage for opening out, and in fact, I wrote, theater, music, and I cut it out because I thought, I can write that everything needs to be done. And if everything is done, then the world will be a better place. And the mental health of women and everyone else will be better. I mean, we do need spaces. Some of the psychoanalysts have said love, work, and play as signs of health. And play is a very important aspect, I think, of being able to find new versions of yourself. So by play, I mean theater, poetry reading, I mean, just creativity, which I think those are potential ways in which we can come in relatively safe ways with peer group, in educational settings where the stigma is not there. We can start encountering parts of ourselves. So I do think that young people's lives are a good time for these kinds of interventions. And we try to do that too when we discuss it in universities and when we are, with our students. The other question I think is actually very complicated, but I would say very simply at one level that I'm drawing from those who have worked in the mental health field, okay? And I think their experiences, okay, so there is one point I want to make here. And that's again complicated. I'm sorry if my mind tends to go in this way, that, there is a relationship between modernity, language, speech, articulation, right? So there are some of us who find it quite easy to say, I feel this, I feel that, I have been troubled by X, Y, and Z, and this is a narrative and a story I want to be able to take to you and discuss it with you and see how I can find answers to it. I think, I mean, there are 2 senses in which I have used religion and spirituality in that, in that talk. So in the latter sense, when I'm talking about spaces where which women can access, there has been work and there are quite a few feminist health workers who have actually, tried to investigate, how these places work. And you find that there is a language there, which is not the language of modernity. And there is a space there where sometimes one's suffering can be articulated. These spaces, however, are also patriarchal spaces quite often. So one has to be careful. It's not, I don't think one should just jump into it and say all of these spaces are, fine. But they can have an alternative language of healing And one really needs to look at, which I have done, all the ethnographies, etc., to see how it really happens. Also, there are spaces where, you can just be relatively wordless. And I think that also is important. I think words are not always available to us. And I do think this is something which I didn't say, but our experiences begin when we do not have words. And I think that too is a part of what makes us up. And so the wordless sometimes needs to find a space. And I think these spaces can be really helpful. So those are two things which I'm saying. There's also body movements, rhythm, all kinds of other things which assist. The other thing which I was saying was different. I mean, I haven't thought through it completely. I think it's my position that spirituality can become a defense against experiencing those aspects of ourselves. It can become an aspect of arrogance, right? I'm going to take up only this one part of it. However, accompanied by other processes, it can render one more open to listen, to enable listening to oneself and to others. And I think and I do think that our capacity to be able to remember that suffering is inherent to life is maybe not something I would like to say to adolescent girls. I'm not saying it in that sense, but I think at another level, I think I've written it as a critique of the idea of mental health, that, you can forget the fact that people can be apparently looking very productive, very happy. And are they really healthy when they cannot at all relate to the suffering around them, or, to have no sense of empathy towards others? So it was in that sense that I was saying.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Rachana Johri. There is a comment from Ashima Sood. A beautiful and very enlightening discussion. I have a question about so-called psychosomatic hormonal, quote-unquote, hormonal disorders like fibromyalgia and CFS. Could the reality of long COVID help subvert these gendered narratives about health syndromes and disorders? And another comment she has made is that to add to Dr. Chettiar's point, women's health concerns are labeled disorders and simultaneously devalued. And after that, Dr. Anita Sood, she said, Aparna, nice to meet you after Pune. But I think I would also request Professor Anita Gai, you are here. We are really honored with your presence. Would you like to unmute and also intervene? Hello. Yeah. Or any of the discussion, would you like to take this?
Hello, Vibhuti ji, how are you? And hi to everyone. I was wondering, Aparna mentioned the social model, and I think I always have had this critique of social model, especially when it comes to gender. So I was wondering, how Aparna would kind of, find this particular model, useful for, issues about really mental health aspects that are there for women with or without disabilities, I think.
Yeah, Vibhuti, can I just...
There are two questions. Yeah, one is this and Aparna Sood's question. Yeah.
Sure. So, in fact, Professor Anita, I would love to hear your critique of the social model in the context. I will just table my idea, but I would love to hear from you since you are here, because the reason why I talked about the idea of bringing disability discourse within mental health, if you look at, I'm also borrowing from Bhargavi's conceptualizations, whereby I think she has moved more and more away from biomedical conceptualizations of mental health and have found disability discourses far more accepting, empowering, rights-based. Professor Rachana also mentioned the entire CRPD, and of course, you are you are an expert on all of that. But what I find most importantly empowering about the social model is that the responsibility of my pain and suffering as well as my healing is not just on me. And I feel that the biomedical discourse, Sylvia Plath says that if you are a woman, you are damned anyway. By definition also you are mad, and if you are a mad woman, now you are mad by diagnosis. So the point that you are trying to make is that how do I say that my suffering is a reflection of the realities in which or the worlds that I inhabit. And therefore, the world is also equally responsible for doing something about this healing and not just me. And don't pathologize me. So I was coming from just that point of view. And you will see, therefore, every institution, formal or informal in the society, has to do something to acknowledge these realities and to accommodate themselves to provide that conducive environment. But I would love to hear from you, why is it that you don't find this model particularly helpful? So since you are the expert on the entire disability discourse, would love to hear from you.
Expert in that sense, but I'm just wondering, I just have more as a, I think, women with disability and having had many love affairs with the doctors. I mean, I was wondering, while I was listening to Rachana, I was putting Iodex on my leg because my legs are like, after the wheelchair, you are there on the whole day. And then you realize that, the legs are, there's no other way that I can reduce, the pain. So when you talk about social model, it actually does not really allow for the body to actually take up, the kind of pain, suffering, vulnerability, all are there. I mean, how we can say that there is a playing field. You, of course, used the motto, nothing for us without us and all that. But is it possible ever that pain can be, erased by having a better society in one sense?
That's
because
right, yeah.
You have some of the parts which the body in itself is kind of, experiencing it, So I think that is something which I really have a problem with the social model, because even when you take up, like, for example, sexuality, of course the rights are there. You can also say that, okay, fine, there's a playing field. But the point is that you'll have to also to find someone out there, no? You can't just simply shoot someone and say that, hey, I want to be like, have a sexual right and I'm going to kind of, do it. So I think that is something, it's not so simple to say that social model will, or society would kind of, pick up, the issues which are there, and there would be a healthy, kind of a society that we would be kind of in it. I think that is something which I feel is important.
Thank you, Professor Anita Gai. There is a comment by Dr. Veena Vaswani, forensic expert. Would you like to unmute and elaborate your point where you have talked about the postpartum conditionality of women and how the medical fraternity responded? Dr. Veena Vaswani. Hello, are you there?
Should I read out what you
Yes, we can read out, yes.
Very insightful discussion. When I was doing internship, more than 3 decades ago, every women's post-delivery complaints, no, it's gone somewhere.
Yeah. Hello,
Wait.
Dr. Veena Vaswani. Can you pose your comment? Are you there, Dr. Veena Vaswani? Then I think we move to Indu Agnihotri's comment. And she says that, Ratna, since you mentioned it, a query, how How come the women's movement emerges as the favorite whipping horse for all? The very assumptions that all the presentations built upon with regard to the lives of women and gender were and are based on learning from the vast, diverse, and hard-gained experiences of the women's movement. Yeah, that's what I would also fully endorse it.
Yeah. No, actually, I can also apologize, Indu, for making this statement. It is, in fact, I'm quoting from Bhargavi. But, I do agree with her, otherwise I wouldn't have quoted. You see, what I think Bhargavi is saying and what I also believe is you're absolutely right, that the conditions of patriarchy, if I may just use a loose word for quick reference, have been spelled out, and for the conditions of discrimination, violence, learned from the women's movement, and I actually don't see myself as being someone outside at all. But it is true that when it comes to a kind of distress, which requires more than what usually we would call friendship or conversations, something more, where, the other is not being able to take in the voice of support for some reason, right? I think, and that's why, and also, just the idea that there can be a kind of distress which our common bonds will not be able to address. I think some of those questions, I think, have made it feel as if the women's movement was not fully ready to acknowledge the idea of psychological distress. I mean, I think that's probably also changed by now. But as a psychologist, Indu, since you're asking the question, I can say one thing, and it's not really with any anger that I'm saying it. I actually understand the problem. But I know that every time I have looked through the list of, areas which are put out at the time of the, in the conference, it's never got something that I feel I would directly want to talk about. And that is even, I mean, as a psychologist by training, even though my entire life I have been, involved in the question of women's lives, it has not been easy for me at all to make this bridge. I must say this, And so there is something that needs to be addressed. I think we are getting there now. But when we set up the gender studies program, next to the psychology program in Ambedkar University, I was really hopeful. But I must say that even over there, it has not been a very productive exercise. Only one or two of us sort of jumping around from one side to the other. The rest are just happily seated in their own spaces because, we talk about rights, but rights are not enough in certain conditions.
Yeah,
something more than that is needed.
I agree.
No, but I think, would you like to speak, Professor Anita Gai?
No,
I agree with you, Indu. I'm not really disagreeing. I must say that also, but just explaining my perspective.
But I think one
look,
thing...
Rachana, I also agree with you in the sense that mental health issues need to be taken up very, very seriously. There's no disagreement. The reason why I'm putting this comment out is that somehow in almost every discussion that one attends, very often, the comments, the most critical comments are coming about the women's movement. What I'm saying is that the women's movement has made this space, which is this, where has this space for discussion on violence, domestic violence, the distress that you are talking about, where has this space and how has it come? And you look at it in terms of the 70s, I mean, 50 years ago, when many of us started out on this journey, I'm talking about our generation, I'm not even taking it back further, and there's a rich history there. But I mean, these were not issues to be, I mean, the psychiatrist, psychotherapy, all that was seen as a totally different, domain. The linkages, the links between distress, society, patriarchy, structures of violence, all that, it is the women's movement which has sort of put it all out there, and through a very long, very difficult experience. It has not been easy for the women's movement. It's not one entity. It has ideologically struggled with itself, but it has opened up that space and platform for different identities to be asserted within the women's movement, and to articulate those identities and as well as the dilemmas. My point is, when you place a criticism, you have to place it in the context. 50 years ago, what was the context of the discussions, both in terms of intellectual space and in terms of social space and movement discourse? I would say the women's movement has in fact done a lot of hand holding, and almost every activist in the movement who has been nurtured in the movement and who has embraced the movement has played a role of counseling, which was totally amateur, which was maybe wrong. We needed professional help, and I think we got there very soon. Many of us who were involved in those activities at the end, for instance, from my experience in ADO, I could say we used to do a lot of it primarily on Saturdays. People like Kalindi Deshpande and I, we used to hold our head at the end of the Saturday and say, we need a session now. We need a session. Because, the kind of lives, the kind of violence you were dealing with, it was not easy for us. I was 26 years old, the same age as your students probably. Yeah. Okay. We were trying to deal with problems and dilemmas which were neither of our making, nor were we trained to deal with. So my point is, when we talk about the women's movement, keep it in mind in terms of how much thought, energy, openness, open-mindedness has been invested in that movement to allow for this space to come about. And I fully know, I'm not saying it with any critical this thing with you, because I know what you
I think it's more like a complaint against a very close friend for not being there enough.
No, not at all. It's a discussion.
It's not. No. What I mean is the emotional spirit of the complaint is more because there is a desire that you could be a little bit more close to us and understanding, rather than one of opposites, right? It is as if one is asking for a little bit more support than one has had, rather than suggesting that you have been, opponents of ours. But I take the point you're making, and I shall keep it in mind next time in any case.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Indu, for making such an important point. And I think my experience, what you were experiencing in Delhi, in IDWA, I think same was my experience as a full-timer of Women's Center. The women who were brought either by police or by medical social worker or psychiatric social worker or by in-laws or their parents, the first thing they said, this woman is mental. In Bombay, that's a word they use, by mental. And just get-togethers, women helping each other, talking to each other, little hand holding. All those women, I think I can name them. They are celebrities now. They are extremely powerful, and they came with the torn clothes and completely bruised bodies and completely mentally shattered, no self-esteem and this thing. And now you see the kind of, and that's why we boast in the feminist movement that anyone who comes in touch with feminist or women's movement would never have a downturn in their life, because there is so much of solidarity. The social solidarity is very important. So I think your presentations have brought in very important, insightful exposition, and also the mental health issues, the way different state groups have handled. I think one thing that emerges very clearly is that cosmetic counseling offered by agony aunts is not for no use. Breakthrough counseling and support work are need of an hour. And to make women's material reality more secure, liberating, and healthy is the only alternative to get out of repeated attacks of mental distress. And that's, I think, the experience of 2 years of COVID pandemic has also shown. Developmental counseling that aims at removal of chronic conflict situation in women's lives is associated with a very also very high mental health morbidity, how to encounter that, and sensitization and training of general practitioners, other health personnel to mental health, particularly minor psychiatric morbidity that we have, anxiety, depression, that is very important. There is a need for social counselors at health posts and public hospitals who are in touch with NGOs providing institutional support to women in social distress, and also sensitization of teachers, the kind of work Cecilia has been doing, and the community workers, youth groups, Mumbai Psychological Association is also doing similar work, and women's organizations. I think they need to converge and they need to have more such important dialogues and also collaborate in terms of practical intervention. Training sessions for professionals and paraprofessional volunteers should focus on supportive network, group cohesion, and solidarity. Training should include modules on interviewing skills, history taking, mental status examination, and also electronic and print media should also be trained in sensitizing the general public about psychological response to violence and providing information about referral services as women and children affected by domestic violence or a man-made or social disasters that have special psychological need. And I think women's groups came together just within 15 days of the national lockdown and came up with a common poster. They created national level networks with each other, with to provide the support for women who were on the move, who were there for reverse migration. And healing is a part of empowerment we all accept. And that's why civil society and the state both should provide more and more opportunities to women of all age groups for self-actualization, so that women can achieve high level of mental health, respect for diversity, plurality, multicultural outlook, ensure democratic and tolerant milieu that is conducive for mental health of women. And as compared to institutionalization based mainly biomedical intervention, community or family-based rehabilitation of mental ill, I would not say mentally ill, but the person facing mental health challenges. I think that's very important, that we all need to have a human touch. And all the speakers, I think both the Dr. Johri and all three discussants, all of them emphasize that urgent need for a community-based engagement. And I think I thank all three of you, Prof Rachana Johri, Dr. Cicilia Chettiar, Dr. Aparna Joshi, and Dr. Amrita Nandy. Over to IMPRI team.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nanima, over to you for vote of thanks.
Thank you. As we come to the end of this extremely enlightening discussion, I, Arunima Marva, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi, would like to formally propose a vote of thanks on behalf of the Gender Impact Studies Center, IMPRI. We are grateful to our speaker, Professor Rachana Johri, and our chair, Professor Vibhuti Patel, for taking out their time and being with us here for this thought-provoking talk on women and mental health. Thank you. We also thank our discussants, Dr. Amrita Nandy, Dr. Cicilia Chettiar, and Dr. Aparna Joshi for adding their diverse perspectives and valuable insights to this deliberation. I would also like to thank Professor Anita Ghai, Professor Indu, and Professor Ashima Sood. And of course, I thank all our participants who are here on Zoom and on Facebook Live for participating and raising questions, and also to our viewers who will be watching us later on YouTube and listening to our podcast. Thank you again, and I hope you continue to tune in on our future episodes of #GenderGap series, as well as other lined up deliberations of IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Good night.